Hello, everyone. Good evening now. My name is Huáscar Castro, and I'm a policy associate with Silicon Valley at Home. And on behalf of Silicon at Home, the Action Fund, it's my pleasure to introduce all of you to coming to our Senate District 13 Candidate Forum. I want to thank all the partners that have been here involved working with us. Alex Melendez with Housing Leadership Corporation, Coalition, Council, my apologies. We have Ian with Tech Equity, and we have partners that aren't here but have been a huge help throughout this process. Silicon Valley Council nonprofits, as well as California EMB and other folks. It's really our pleasure to be here and have these candidates come in to share their perspectives on key housing issues. And before we get started with everything else, I want to recognize a couple folks in here, some elected officials in attendance. We have Laura Casas from the Foothill Dienta School District. Thank you so much. And we have Liz Ness, Council Member, City of Palo Alto. Perfect. Am I missing anybody else who I failed to mention? No? Okay, thank you. And so before we get started, another partner who I really want to thank, because this is a fantastic space and they've really done a great job of helping us throughout the process. I really want to thank Gina Zalma with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. If you'd like to come and provide some remarks, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Huáscar. Thank you so much. I'm also a proud board member of SV at Home Action Fund. Welcome, everybody. What an absolute pleasure to have you here at your community foundation today. I have the absolute privilege of serving as Senior Vice President for Public Policy here, and I'm especially interested and excited to be here because housing is such a target area for our work. We know that if we don't help solve the housing crisis, so many of our neighbors are suffering. So thank you so much for being here. Huáscar didn't mention that the bathrooms are outside the doors to the left, and there's a lot of food there for you. So welcome, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina, for that. A couple little other housekeeping items is throughout the forum. I'm going to go ahead and start passing out note cards and a couple of pens per each aisle, because we will have a Q&A portion, so you have the ability to go ahead and fill out some questions, and then towards the end, pass them to me. I'll pass out note cards and pens, so don't feel that on your end. And then from there, we'll get going. I'd like to introduce our moderator, who's graciously offered to be here, Lou Hansen with the San Jose Mercury News. Thank you so much, Lou.
Thanks, Huáscar. And thank you all for coming out here. I'm Lou Hansen. I'm a housing reporter at the San Jose Mercury News. The Mercury News in the past 2 years has put a lot of emphasis and reporters on covering housing, because we realize it's one of the top issues that's troubling and challenging the Bay Area. So I'd also like to thank our hosts, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which is fantastic, and I look forward to a great conversation here. I'll introduce our fine challengers for Senate District 13. Starting to my left, this is Shelly Masur, Vice Mayor of Redwood City. Annie Oliva, City of Millbrae Council Member. Sally Lieber, a former California Assembly member and former mayor of Mountain View. Mike Brownrigg, who is a council member in the city of Burlingame. And Josh Becker, who is a businessman and longtime Menlo Park resident. So thank you all for being here. As you know, housing is a huge issue for this community. And it really doesn't matter if you rent or you own or you're living in an RV on the side of El Camino Real. Everyone is affected by what's going on in this community. We really want to hear some of the issues that you would like to get to if you were elected to the Senate seat. So I'll start this off, and Shelly, we'll start with you, and then we'll work our way down. On these major questions, I'd like to have about a minute to answer, and then 30 seconds for any follow-ups. So Shelly, as Senator, what would your #1 housing priority be?
Well, just actually spent half of my day already talking about housing, so thanks for giving us an opportunity to talk some more about it. I think that, you know, what we've seen in this area is the need to produce more housing, right? I mean, that's sort of the bottom line, is we don't have enough homes for the people who are here. We also don't have enough affordable homes in particular. So #1 priority has got to be on, I think, the 3 Ps, production, preservation, and protection. So we need to produce more, we need to preserve what we've got, and we need to make sure that people who are in housing are protected.
So the first question is very, very broad, and I think that we can talk about the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs, and that's what I wanted to start with. I'm tired of the name calling. I think that what we need to do is make sure that we make the right choices. And with those right choices, there's no doubt that we need more housing. But yet, Sacramento's made some really poor policies in going forward on the need for housing and how to dictate the housing. And what I would like to see is better choices, better policies, so that we can listen to both groups of people on where housing should exist and should not exist. And we can't speak about housing in particular unless we talk about transportation. Quite frankly, we need more trains that don't go nowhere. We need trains that are going to take us to housing that's affordable, and they need to be electric, they need to be clean, and they need to be more frequent. So when we talk about the issue of housing, I don't want to neglect the subject of transportation as well.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for being here, and the Community Foundation for having us. I would say that my priorities in terms of housing are to make sure that we have housing at every economic level. And it's very clear by the numbers right now that what we're lacking is housing for people who earn at or below the median income. We have a very high median income in both Santa Clara County and San Mateo County. They're right around $117,000 per year. And there are so many people that are below that level but are critically needed by society to be our support personnel, to be good neighbors, to be important parts of our community, to be the community volunteers who always step up. So I am very eager to work to see that all housing levels are available, especially those low-income housing levels, and to make sure that transit and small business are linked to housing, that housing is looked at as climate policy, and that we address that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. The affordability crisis is the reason I got into the race in the first place. I've been a city councilman for 10 years. I've been mayor twice. I am proud that starting a process several years ago resulted in us rezoning a commercial area in Burlingame. For a city that has hardly added housing at all in 40 years, we will increase the housing units by 20% in the next 10 years. In fact, just over the last 2 years, we've either built, approved, or have in process 2,000 housing units, which is equal to 15% of our housing stock. So pretty dramatic, and I'm proud of that. I agree with Shelly's 3 Ps. I'm going to drill down on a couple of actual ideas. So I think a lot of the barriers are financially driven. So one, I'd like to see the state create a better subsidy pool so that developers of private property, and most of these lands are privately held, can have a deeper level of affordability. The second thing I'd like to do, and I'm not going to have time to explain it, is create a pool of capital so that nonprofits can buy apartment buildings that are coming on market that are de facto affordable. I think that's really important.
Well, thanks. We all hear these stories, and I was in Sunnyvale not that long ago with a number of faith-based groups, and we were there to hear from the residents of the mobile home park, and we were there with an 18-year teacher in one of our better paid school districts here, and she stunned us all by saying she couldn't afford to buy in that mobile home park. So it's a huge issue. I'm proud. I started Full Circle, a nonprofit, 20 years ago, and we identified affordable housing as one of our first 3 areas. We saw at the time the impact that the growth of the tech community was having on housing affordability. And that's one of the issues. We've simply approved way too many jobs without the housing to keep up. And so these well-paid workers are pricing out nurses and teachers and others who make up our dwindling middle class. So one of my priorities, I'll look forward to talking more about today, is we need a massive investment in affordable housing. When I talk to city managers here, they say, when we lost redevelopment, we lost so much. We have this little pocket, this pocket, this pocket. It doesn't get us to where we were even before redevelopment. So I have a lot of plans I'll talk about to have a massive infusion of capital for affordable housing.
Thank you, Josh. And we'll stay with you for this next question, follow-up question. It strikes me as that we have a lot of local experience on this board. Could you tell us, what do you feel the state's role should be when it comes to production, preservation, that can add to the housing stock that we have and preserve what we have? What's the state's role?
Yeah, well, I'd say three things. First, the state has to set the number of housing. Oops, sorry, I'll get that. Thanks, Jonathan. That's okay. We need to set the number of housing that we need, and that has to be ambitious. We have our RENA cycle coming up, our Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and all indications is it will be very ambitious if we follow what's happened in Southern California. So the state needs to set the standards for how much housing that we need. Second, the state can be a friend to the cities and do things like one of my proposals to backfill impact fees. So affordable housing developers and people who are building for the missing middle, they pay impact fees, and oftentimes $175,000 per door in impact fees for parks and schools. The state could say, hey, you don't have to pay those fees, and we will raise money and backfill those fees. So to be a friend of the cities. And thirdly, to hold cities accountable. With AB 72 that passed in 2017, HCD can now sue cities or hold cities responsible in other ways that don't meet their housing elements. And like Cupertino, we can do that now.
So I think it's good that the state has been a bully pulpit. Yes, we have a housing crisis. I actually think the problem with the current approach is that it diagnoses local officials as the reason we're not building housing. But look at Mountain View, look at Redwood City, look at Burlingame, look at San Carlos. We're building housing. So, you know, what the state needs to do is actually fix the issues that exist, and they are largely financial. So more capital for redevelopment, that would help. Helping nonprofits buy these. So look, here's newsflash. We're going to have a massive wave of displacement because a lot of these apartment buildings are owned by mom and pops. They're getting older, and when they sell, they have not been raising rents dramatically. But when they sell, the new profit-maximizing buyers, they're the ones who had granite countertops and double the rents. So we need to help the nonprofit sector buy those buildings by cutting red tape and giving the sellers a tax break so that we incent them to sell. That's one thing the state can do. Another thing the state can do is help school boards get comfortable with building teacher housing. School boards are not real estate developers. They don't want to take the risk. So the state could guarantee that risk and underwrite it.
Yeah, I agree with so much that's been said. I think that the state can play a very strong role in putting the incentives in place and the requirements that cities provide the housing that is needed, and that it be linked to transit and linked to small business. When the local cities are talked about, you know, here in Mountain View and also in Redwood City, we've done a great job, I think, of adding market rate housing and planning for more density of housing. But the affordable amount that has been built is woefully short. In both of the cities, we've actually built about 3% of the need for affordable housing. So I think that we need to also have the state requiring that the cities do more on issues like safe parking and compact affordable housing that is affordable to the people who really need it in our communities.
So as far as what the state is doing, I want to address that for 1 second, and that's the SB 50, of which I can't agree, and I think that that's what we have to look to do in the near future, is to avoid catastrophes like that. I mean, the fact remains that we are going to destroy our single family neighborhoods if we allow for the state to be on top of us and telling us where to build housing. Of course we need housing. I spent my whole professional life trying to find affordable houses for people. And we need to have them near transit, and we need to have them, like Michael said, built in areas that are accepting these housing units. But if we want to destroy the characteristics of the unique beautiful district that we live in, we have mandates like SB 50 telling us to do that. That is something I would not be in favor of, and I think there's so much that can be done that we have done in places like Millbrae that I do sit on the council with, where we have just broke ground where veterans preferred affordable housing, which is the perfect definition of affordable housing, will exist.
Well, it's appropriate to be having this conversation today, given that the vote on SB 50 happened, right? So hopefully everybody saw the results of the vote.
I wasn't going to forget that.
Is it a separate question?
Please, go ahead.
So it failed, 18 to 15, I think was the final vote. It does have the opportunity to come back. And I actually am the only person up here who has supported SB 50. I did work with Senator Wiener last year to address some amendments that I thought were important for cities, including giving cities an opportunity to do their own transit-oriented development plans within a limited amount of time. And if they didn't, then the provisions of SB 50 would kick in. Additionally, not exempting small counties, the Marin exception. And so there have been some revisions to that. So I have supported it. I will just say quickly, one of the things I was also working on this morning, started my day talking with Assemblymember Mullen's office to work on some bill language that would make it easier for cities and school districts and other public agencies to work together to build housing and prioritize their own workers.
I'm glad you mentioned SB 50. I'm sure everyone in the crowd would like to hear more about SB 50 as well. You're correct. At least as of now, it did not pass the Senate today on an 18-15 vote. There's one more day left. So, Shelly, why don't you take us through why, and why don't you address the issue that that Annie brought up, that character is at stake in our communities.
I think one of the misconceptions about SB 50 is that it sets like a number of places that a certain number of units that are going to have to be developed. That's obviously through our RENA cycle. And by the way, the numbers we heard today from ABAG is they're estimating 600,000 for the Bay Area. So it is a significant increase over the previous RENA cycle. And that in the current RENA cycle, we're only at 15% of meeting our affordable housing goals. But back to your question on, I think, you know, it is a complicated issue, and I think there is concern about cities being able to make decisions about where they want housing and what type of housing that they want. I do want to say that there are a lot of safeguards in there for cities to be able to still have objective design standards. They can still have their zoning, and there's a lot of pieces in there that really keep cities control over what they want to do around building housing. But I think the big concern is loss of local control.
Sure. Annie, what do you say to folks that like SB 50 and who say character is one of the things that got us into this housing crisis? Too much character, too little building.
Proof in the pudding. I live in Millbrae, sit on city council in Millbrae, and we have the largest transportation hub west of the Mississippi. That's where housing was to belong. Yet, we are a small community. We needed to be sustainable. And of course, the traffic was going to be impacted, the schools are going to be impacted, and so was our fire and our police, our safety structure. Well, what we had to do is we had to look at the project. We had to make it sustainable for the city. We made adjustments. We have retail. We have mixed use. We have commercial. We have a hotel and affordable housing, veterans preferred housing on that project. That's how you keep the character of the city, allowing for more housing that is so necessary today, and also putting it near transit.
Some observations that I wanted to make was a part of SB 50 that I think is still in the bill. There's been a lot of twists and turns throughout the process, was that single-family homes could not be replaced by multifamily housing. And one of the realities is that nearly all of the peninsula's communities are built out. So the opportunities to get more housing are on surface parking lots adjacent to Caltrain, through ADUs, And there are some great innovations in terms of ADUs in Santa Cruz County. There is, I think it's very low or almost free financing to be able to put an ADU and no fees to put an ADU in your backyard. That's the granny cottages that have been very successful. So there are a lot of different pathways for this. But I've also seen some examples. Oh, darn. And I'll tell you about that later because my time's up.
Sorry, Lou, you were tailoring it, but I'll just keep going. Is that it?
Please.
Okay. So I want to just briefly stand up for local control. The reason being it's how our leadership steers the communities for all of us. And so there's always been a theory in American government that you should push decision-making down to the level where it's closest and most effective. So I just want to stand up for that theory. But here's the reason I don't like SB 50. The local control is an issue, but actually I don't think it would work. So here's what it says. It says if you have single-family homes near transit, you have to let people build apartment buildings, basically. Fundamentally, that's the way it works. So if you're a developer, you have to aggregate 2 parcels, maybe 4. So right away, you're taking 4 expensive parcels to build a building that's going to be 5 stories high. What are you going to build? You're going to build luxury condos. So at the end of the process, you're going to have 4 single-family homes that maybe each have an ADU demolished, and you're going to have an apartment building with luxury condos instead. And it's going to take a long time, and it's not going to yield very much housing. The way we did it by rezoning a commercial area, we'll get way more units way faster. And we already have 300 units. The day after it passed, we had a proposal for 300 units.
Please.
Well, as Sally says, it is a bit of a work in progress. What I've said is really 3 things. One is that there are parts that are still unclear to me about the revised version. Secondly, I am cautious about state preemption, although I do support state intervention, as I mentioned. And thirdly, SB 50 has sucked up a lot of the oxygen for something that I think can provide some housing down the road, but we're losing our lower income and middle income residents now. And we need solutions now, not 3-4 years from now. That was it? Oh. Okay.
Keep going.
Okay.
Keep going.
I was like, I thought I had more time. Get my train of thought. So one of the questions I've raised, one of the revisions is to create local flexibility plans. But as I read the bill, the state has until HCD, the Housing Department in Sacramento, has until July of 2021 to set those plans. Presumably, then cities have 6 to 12 months to develop those plans, and then after, in a year or 2 to see if cities actually comply with those plans. And so then you're looking pretty far out. And as we mentioned, we're in a RENA cycle right now with 600,000 units in the Bay Area, and with new enforcement provisions and availability from HCD. So I'm just not sure why it's needed in that way.
That's great. You've obviously thought about this issue quite a bit. How would you improve SB 50? Would you have to scrap it, or are there tweaks that could make this better, more workable? And Josh, you can continue on.
Well, as I mentioned, those are some of the questions that I've had about it, and I'd like to see how those are answered. Again, I think it's more of a longer-term solution when you look at it the way that I laid it out. So that's why I focused right now on the massive infusion of affordable housing, money for affordable housing now. David Chu has had a bill to take the housing tax credit available from $80 million to $500 million. And we've passed that now as a one-time last year. It's in the budget as a one-time. Again, I'd like to make that permanent. Jim Bell has led with SB 5, which was basically a new take on redevelopment, hopefully getting rid of the parts about SB redevelopment that people did not like, and I support the revised version of that. We also passed a revised housing bond, regional housing bond. So now we have the authority to do that. We can do that and take some of my proposals, like backfilling impact fees for affordable and middle-income developers.
I think there's a point in any legislation where it's been so changed, it's not worth continuing to try to amend. So I'm not sure SB 50 is worth saving. I do think that we have to hold cities accountable to delivering housing. And whether that's through SB 50 amended, or it's through a regional housing needs assessment process that has more teeth, I think that's a legitimate way to do it, and then work with each city to make sure they have a path forward. Let me just point out something that we probably all know. Most of this land is privately held. So we have to find a way to work within private developers' economics so that we can deliver the affordable housing that we want. Where we sit on public land, let's build affordable housing. My city took an at-grade parking lot. We broke ground 3 months ago on building 154 units of affordable housing in a 5-story building in the middle of my downtown. 54 for seniors, 78 for working families, 82 of the units held for people making only half the area median income. If you think that was easy for me to get done in Burlingame, you haven't been to my city lately.
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that SB 50 is not dead yet. It's on reconsideration, so it will be brought up again this week. I guarantee it. And so that's still out there. But also in a room of activists, I want to recognize that, you know, city councils can do upzoning. They can vote for more density. They can work to put together packages of financing to save existing housing, to keep people in their homes, to vote to support the legal services that people need to be able to stay in their homes and their communities. And so there's a lot that we can do without just simply waiting for the state to step in and do something. And I think also while we're waiting for the big movement, whatever that is we have to look at the needs of people who are overnighting on the 22 bus and on the ECR bus, and the usability and the safety of our shelters, and what's being planned for the future versus what's actually being built.
So I think pretty much everything's been said and agreed upon with regards to what Sally and Michael said. I think the upzoning is a great idea. Most of the locals jurisdictions have a hard time finishing their general plan, and it's always a work in process. And I think that that'd be something that we could all look at as local officials. And how can the state help? They can incentivize those that are taking the bull by the horn. Give them kudos. Give them something that will allow for them to help with their infrastructure to where they are building the housing. Give them something for transportation. The state can help in a lot of ways than dictating where and how to put housing.
Oh, right. I mean, yes, that is true. City councils can do all of those things. They can upzone. We've done it in Redwood City. We did a precise plan that streamlined approval processes, so we had 2,500 units of new homes go up in just a couple of years. And we can provide funding. We've done that in Redwood City. We've created an affordable housing fund. We've helped nonprofits buy homes. We've helped fund new affordable housing. We've done all of those things in Redwood City. And yet, as much as we do, we're still having this conversation, right? It's not just what one city can do. It's about what we can do as a region. And so the reason that Sacramento is looking at us with this eye of like, yeah, you can do these things, but you're not doing them in every single city, that's why a bill like SB 50 comes into being. I did just want to point out that actually Sacramento has recently provided us all with money for planning, to redo our housing elements, to redo our general plans, to redo whatever kind of planning we want to do around housing. Sacramento's provided money for that. So it is also doing the incentivizing at the same time that it's looking at the other side.
Thank you. Very thoughtful answers. I'd like to move on to issues with renters. We have in the Bay Area some of the highest rents. I think in the apartments surrounding this building that we're having this conversation, the rents are probably equal to what they would be in Manhattan.
They're higher.
Yes, they are higher in many cases. This year, AB 1482. Providing some renter protection came in, as well as a cap on how much annual rent increases could go up. How do you stand on that? And Shelly, please start.
Well, actually, Redwood City was the first city to enact AB 1482 ahead of its January deadline. What we saw was there was a huge challenge as soon as it was enacted, which, you know, was somewhat predictable that the bill passed and there was a sort of window where landlords could evict people, and that was what was happening in Redwood City. They were supposed to be complying with some retroactive provisions around rental increases. Some were not. So we went ahead and responded to the needs of our community and took action in October to enact the provisions of 1482. You know, I think for myself, haven't been a big supporter of rent control, I'll just say that. But I think in this instance, we were able to work to get some reasonable rent increases that most owners are already doing. So it's really just addressing some of those owners that are flipping and raising the rent really high, making it impossible for people to stay in their homes.
So yes, we do have a lot, very, very high rents, and that's what I do on my daily basis. I'm a property manager, and SB 1482 was horrific to the homeowners that were the mom and pa's that were very, very good to their tenants. They were so good, they become family members, basically. And what happened with 1482 was very, very scary for those people that could go 5% plus CPI. And the fact is, everybody's rent was raised, not because they wanted to, but they felt they had to. Rent control, we have not seen where it's worked. In fact, they've even taken rent control and they've renamed it. I mean, I've heard rent stabilization, rent leverage. I've heard all kinds of names to it just so that they could figure how they could get it passed. But the fact that rent control, which has been existing in San Francisco for a long period of time, that has one of the highest rents in our state, there's 35,000 vacant units in the city of San Francisco because owners do not want to rent out the house and get into issues with tenants. So I think that definitely is something that I wouldn't support. I don't think it works. And I know that we need more housing, and supply and demand is what we need to do in order to control the rents.
And now we'll change the channel. So we always say change the channel when we're here. So I strongly support rent control because it works. It works. It preserves housing for actual people. And if you haven't heard about Measure D in Mountain View, we've got some information back here. We all need to vote no on Measure D. It's deceptive. It's a ploy by the very large-scale corporate landlords to be able to charge more in Mountain View. And I think that we have a special duty of care in the mobile home parks because people are really economically pressed there. They have purchased their home and they're paying space rent. And I can say when I was on city council in Mountain View, just about the highest space rent that anyone paid was $600 a month. Now people are paying more than $4,000 a month. And as the space rent goes up, the value of their homes goes down. And they are still paying on those homes. And because the park owners can refuse any and all buyers for any reason or no reason at all, they can leave it so that the only buyer of a home is the park owner themselves. And they're ripping off old people.
I want to ditto Sally's comments on that last segment. I completely agree, and it's an issue that we have to address. Look, with respect to rent control, it's now settled, and it's time. You know, for me, I'm a practical person. If that hasn't come across, I want to get more housing. More housing will do good for everybody. So, and if we don't get more housing, then we're going to be in real trouble. And I did worry that a strict rent control could inhibit construction, and I have to say, I'm a little worried that now setting a limit of sort of 9%, a lot of our landlords were raising rent 3%, 4%. Now I think they're going to feel 9% is the target, and they just do it. So, but anyway, what I do want to say is I want to elaborate on what I said earlier. I am very concerned that a lot of these buildings owned by mom and pops are going to sell. And when they sell, those buildings that are below market right now, de facto affordable, will get changed. And so we need to help nonprofits compete and win when those buildings come up for sale. And if we could get 10 or 15% of the housing stock in nonprofit ownership hands, we could have a huge impact on rents across a market and make a real difference. And so my time's up.
Well, I'll agree with Sally and Michael on mobile home parks, and I have a stat for you. Across California, there are 1 million people. Oh, Shelly, can you use this one 'cause I'm too loud? Across California, there are 1 million people who live in mobile home parks, so it's a massive issue. As far as 1482, we do have a compromise, and I support the compromise. Although we have to look, we have to be careful about unintended consequences. That was an example where we passed something, and then all of a sudden these evictions went up, and cities had to do these emergency protections. And luckily, many of our cities did step up and do so. But that, to me, that gets to the issue of preservation. And I think if you talk to, and I talk to my friends like David Chu up there, they say Sacramento's not done a lot in preservation. And one area that we could do a lot more is in rental assistance. So it's much more compassionate and ultimately much more economic to keep people in their homes rather than try to house someone once they have been unhoused. So there's a lot more we can do with preservation and rental assistance.
Thank you. Sally, I wanted to follow up on, you raised a great issue with mobile homes. In San Jose, there's the fourth largest park in the state, West Wind's Mobile Home Park. Residents there, 1,600 of them, received letters that warned them that they could be evicted. That is one of the main sources of affordable housing that's left in the Bay Area. Talk about what the state role is in protecting mobile home parks, or finding a way for them to, that very valuable property that's sitting on them, still be preserved for some kind of affordable housing.
Yeah, and this is one of the most frustrating areas of policy in Sacramento, because the fact is that the state does very, very, very little other than mandate through the mobile home residency law, just very minimal conditions. And I think that HCD has the funding to go out to each mobile home park about once every 10 to 15 years to inspect. And that's why we've seen some of the horror stories about conditions in terms of electricity and sewage and et cetera. And I was out at West Winds the other day meeting with some of the residents there, and that was in my assembly district. Even though it's not in this district, I'm still in touch with folks there. And it really breaks your heart to see people that have paid their rent for years and years and years and are facing eviction. And it is one of the few economical places that people can live. And I think that we need to look at the issues to protect our homeowners and renters in the mobile home parks. And we also have to look at the other issues that feed into this. Last night, there was an item up in Mountain View, outsourcing of janitorial services, $16 an hour. Should we pay them benefits? But at the same time, the city is cracking down on people living in the RVs. Well, where are people to go? What are people to do? Can we please have some mercy for people?
Amen. With respect to mobile home parks, it strikes me, and I'll just acknowledge that I'm not an expert in mobile home park law or legal structures, but it feels to me like a market that's broken. And the ownership, the mixed ownership structure doesn't feel fair to me. And I don't like economic models where the underlying economics are unfair to one of the rights holders. And I think a mobile home owner is a rights holder. So I think we need to look at rebalancing those rights from the landlord, so to speak, to the homeowner, and need to make sure that somebody who's built equity in their home doesn't have it wiped away through malice or
simple escalation in
or
rent.
neglect. Right, exactly. So how that looks, Lou, I'm not sure, but I think it's important. Again, it gets back to this point that there are a lot of people that own or manage de facto affordable properties in one form or another, and the state needs to sort of make sure that those processes don't get into profit maximization modes, which then will drive a lot of people out. Sorry.
Well, back to what I just was talking about was preservation, and I think this falls into preservation. And again, that stat: 1 million people across California live in mobile home parks, and it's an area that we need to do more in preservation generally. And you know, what we've seen is, again, it's just much more compassionate, of course, and much more economic to keep people in their homes. And we've seen some experiments right now in Oakland around rental assistance, and there's a lot more that we can do with guidance and support from the state.
Annie?
So, I mean, I don't really know West Wing, so I don't want to talk about it specifically. But I will make a point to go there because it's not a story I like to hear. I'm just thinking that with regards to solutions to something like that, I would support something that would maybe put something to an effect of a lease that could be a longer lease, because the land is leased by these mobile homeowners, where it could be for the protection of their life. We have life estates. We could do something to maybe write up something that would protect them for the life of their occupancy in the mobile home, and it would be fair on both sides, because you'd have a homeowner that would be with a landowner that would be protected by collecting rents, and you'd have somebody that really was not depreciating anything other than their own home that they own, with the protection of a life lease of some sort. And I'm not an expert either, Michael, on this, but something to that effect might be able to protect both sides.
Well, I dare say none of us are experts in mobile home park law.
Actually, I am.
Okay, Sally is. I didn't hear. So I didn't hear what the state could do. So, okay. Well, anyway, a few things. I do think that better oversight in terms of making sure that there are good living conditions for people who are currently living in the parks. So potentially that means increasing staffing in the housing community, and it's Housing Community Development Department, right? HCD. So the people who are there are having good conditions. But I think there's another piece that we could think about, which is we talked a few minutes ago about AB 1482, which put some caps on the amount of increases of rents. Potentially you could include mobile home parks in that. It's not currently included, is my understanding. So that's one opportunity to make a difference. I do also know from talking to some owners that it's fairly complicated, because you're also paying sewer and a variety of other sort of just general services fees that that the owners don't have control over, so that when local jurisdictions increase those costs, they have to figure out how they're going to pay for them as well.
I'd like to switch to another community that has been in the news recently, and that's student housing, and that's been an issue that's important to some of the folks in this room as well. There was a recent statewide survey of community college students, and 1 in 5 reported that they were homeless at some point during the previous year. And in San Jose, it was 1 in 4. How do you address this issue from a statewide level? There was a proposal last year that got tabled that would allow students to sleep in their cars in the parking lots. What's the answer here?
So that was Assemblymember Berman's bill. And, as he has said, it's not that he thinks it's fair that students need to be able to sleep in their cars, but we at least need to be able to provide some relief and give them a place to be. So they can sleep in their cars on a campus, at least they can go to the facilities and use the showers and the bathrooms, et cetera. So I do think that bill is an interim measure, but we also need to address the ability for community colleges in particular to be able to build student housing. The funding for student housing is complicated. There's a whole variety of issues around being able to build that. But given where we sit, it has to be a piece of the conversation. San Mateo Community College District has built teacher and staff housing, but they haven't yet been able to move into the student housing area. They've talked about it, and they're working on it, but I think that's going to need to be the next step that we take.
I agree 100%. We don't really have to reinvent the wheel for the housing. The community colleges have teacher housing that works very, very well, and we can incorporate student housing as well with the large campuses that we have in our community colleges. I think that what Mark Berman did was something that was a perfect example of how government could work. When there's an emergency, when kids are living, students are living in their cars, they need to be safe. So to open up the parking lots and make sure that there's security and safety and people watching out for each other, I was 100% for that emergency bill. I'll call that an emergency bill.
Well, I think one thing that we can do is have specific funding in the next statewide housing bond for student housing at community colleges. And I think it needs to be on kind of a regional basis and don't get stuck on having it at campus, because there are many, many students who have classes at more than one campus, and they need to connect to transit, to jobs, and et cetera. But look, there have always been students who are homeless at Foothill College, at other colleges. There have always been students who live in the parking or the expressway roundabout at Foothill. And we need to do more for the college students and need to have more food support for them, pay more for on-campus jobs. I know that Foothill has just agreed to pay a little bit more for the students who have on-campus work, and we need to give support to them. The community colleges are especially important because over 70% of students of color in higher ed are in the community colleges.
So thank you, Mark Berman. But what an appalling statement that it's come to kids sleeping in their cars to go to school. So we absolutely have to fix it. There's a couple of, again, practical guy. I want to actually get things done. So we need to have a school bond so that the community colleges don't have to shoulder this. We ought to allow that housing to count towards a city or county, whatever it sits, as part of their RENA numbers so that there's local support for having greater density. And I think that's a perfectly valid argument that it is creating affordable housing. And then what I'd also like to do, and this is a little bit astray, but I'd like to see so we have 3 great community colleges in San Mateo County and 2 more in Santa Clara County. I'd like to see us put a bolt-on 4-year degree program on one of those or more than one of those community colleges so that those working kids who are struggling to go to, I know there's a small one in Foothill, but I'd love to see it expanded, and we don't have anything in San Mateo County. I'd love to see those working kids who are fighting to get themselves an AD degree, now all of a sudden they decide a BA degree is what they want. I'd like them to be able to stay on campus, not have to go across a bridge or get onto 101 to finish their education, which frankly is an inhibition for a lot of these kids.
Well, it is a dire situation, and just as we've seen, I think on the federal level, when we've had appalling conditions and appalling leadership that has spurred activism across the country, particularly in this neighborhood and in this district. One of the bright spots is we're seeing activism by the students. One of the best, most energetic political events I've been to this year, except for my own events, of course, was the event that Liz Niss hosted at her home for Measure G and H. And it was the students that were the students speaking about their leadership of a bond campaign that would include housing. And I've been to De Anza a couple times recently and speaking at political science classes, and the students are leading this charge. They are the ones who are making this happen. So if there's a positive, it's the activism now that we're seeing the students, and we can be leaders here again locally.
Thank you. That kind of segues into a broader issue of homelessness and the multifaceted reasons behind it. And right now, California is not only leading the nation in economic growth, but also in homelessness. how do you attack the issue, and what's the state's role in something that can be a very local issue? Josh?
Well, we need to treat it like it is, as a public health emergency. And I'm glad the governor is now doing this. And I think he's actually used those words and called it a public health emergency. And we need to act with compassion. We can't get inured to the sight of people living on the streets or people living in RVs. The state can and must do more. I'm encouraged by some of the recent steps. The governor putting $1 billion towards this, having emergency shelters being put up. And I'd say a couple things. One, it gets back to one of our other solutions for affordable housing. We need to protect the state's role to prioritize affordable housing on government and surplus land. There have been a number of cases recently, and San Jose, including San Jose recently, where the decision was to protect the government's role there. Second, we have a 1% surcharge on incomes over $1 million for mental health. And Darrell Steinberg, who led that effort, is now leading the effort to use some of that money to address permanent supportive housing for the homeless, and that's $1 billion a year.
So I know this sounds simplistic, but the answer is in the question. So how do you fix homelessness? You need homes, right? We need homes. You can't push somebody out of a tent and say, now I expect you to, go somewhere else and survive and succeed. So we need homes. Roughly a third of the population are working 40 hours a week, showering in the gym, showering at work. Those folks need to get into housing right away so that they don't fall into a place where they can't recover. That should be simple. The second 2/3 are folks who have mental illness or substance addiction. There they need wraparound services. We as cities need to step up with the state to help deliver more sites for temporary housing and those places for wraparound services. What's going to come to all of our communities is a requirement that we house people. And all of us as city leaders need to figure out how we're going to do that. And it's going to be expensive. And I'll say this, Sacramento needs to step up. I think this is absolutely a critical issue. I do not think it's fair to tell cities, here's a critical issue, you figure out how to build housing and support services all by yourselves. And by the way, fix your parks, fix your police, pay for police and the rest of it. So Sacramento can help.
As local officials too, and you can follow up on this, it's very unpopular to place a wraparound service, a homeless center in a community.
Right.
Is there a role for the state to play to make that easier for locals?
Yes.
Yeah, I think when I was in the state assembly, I carried the legislation to require communities to report on what they were doing to meet their own needs of extremely low income and supportive housing. And another area that hardly anyone talks about, but that we critically need, is housing for people with developmental, intellectual disabilities, to be able to be independent adults and to not have to stay at home for their whole lives, or
their parents died.
Yeah, they need to have a home. And in terms of homelessness, it used to be that a city of any size would have a YW and a YMCA. And these were places that had rooms that were small, clean, quiet, a lock on the door. That's all that many single adults need. We have to look at family homelessness, all the families that are in the car with their kids. And I think that as local elected officials or appointed or activists or whatever role we're in, we have to push cities to do the things that they need to do to be responsible and to have those services available and not just push people into overnighting on the bus.
So students and teachers living in their cars, that's a housing problem. Homeless people is a drug and a mental health issue. And we are being numbed by the amount of people that are living on our streets. And I'm going to say something. When I see a homeless person, I know it could be any one of us. It could be our mom, our dad, our brother, or sister, and in my case, my son. He deals with drug addiction and mental health issues. And when those issues bring you down, they bring you all the way down. Sacramento needs to let us provide shelter and care for these people. And that's one of my priorities that I'm going to do when I get to Sacramento. These people are people living on our streets.
Well, thank you, Annie. We always are honored when you share that story, so thank you for sharing that. I'll say I started my career in nonprofits, working in an organization that served homeless women and their children in New York City. At the time, women were not allowed to bring their children into shelters in New York City shelters. So the woman who founded it started the organization to meet that need. I think there's a lot of dimensions to homelessness, right? There's a lot of reasons. We've heard from everybody. There's different reasons why people become homeless. But I think what Utah did is a model for California. Utah had a housing first policy. And in that housing first policy, the premise is you can't address any of these other issues if people don't have a safe place to be at night. And so they invested in it. They, once they were able to work with people to get them into housing, because I recognize it's not like you just say to somebody, oh, here's a house, and then they go happily into the house necessarily. Some will, some won't. But anyway, you invest in it. You provide the services once they're in. They were able to reduce their chronically homeless population by over 80% in 15 years. They disinvested, and now it's back up.
Please.
Sure.
That program's awesome. And if you look at the budget, we can't afford not to do it because we are spending more in our emergency rooms. And if we don't necessarily need extra bonds passed, we need a better budget to make this work. We are wasting money by not addressing this issue.
Thanks, Annie.
Can I add one piece on that too?
Sure.
Which is another dimension of that. Yeah. Well, the other dimension of that is LGBTQ seniors. One of the grants, so I started Full Circle, which is a nonprofit grant-making group, and one of the grants I'm really proud of is Open House in San Francisco, and this is an organization that provides housing for LGBTQ seniors. A lot of these were pioneers of the gay rights movement. And if it wasn't for Open House, they'd be out on the streets. So it's another dimension I wanted to bring up.
Thank you. Any other personal stories that we...
Well, I just wanted to point out that in terms of Housing First, we've had a Housing First policy in Santa Clara County and the surrounding Bay Area counties for about 10 years. But we don't have the actual facilities to back it up. So we tell people, Housing First, there are very few shelter spaces here. And if there isn't a place for people to get housed, even on a temporary basis, even to just get out of the storm, then it doesn't make any sense. I think that the Housing First policy is a good idea, but there has to be a place to send people to. Well, Michael, did you want to double dip first?
Well, I just want to, I mean, what I said was we need to invest in a Housing First policy. I just want to be clear about that. You can have a policy that says you should do this thing, but if you don't invest in it, it's not going to happen. So it has to have an investment behind it. That was really what I was trying to say.
Thank you. And thank our audience because they have come up with some wonderful questions for us right now.
Thank you, audience.
Good job, everyone.
Shelly, I think it's your turn. Should cities be allowed to prevent overnight parking on streets, creating a de facto ban on vehicle dwelling?
That is such a difficult issue. And, in Redwood City, we have not done that. And we've had a pretty big explosion, as other cities have, of people moving to Redwood City in their RVs. I don't think it's as simple as preventing overnight parking. We have to provide alternative places for people to park so that they don't have to park on the street. So that's what we're working on in Redwood City. We have a safe parking committee that is bringing some recommendations to us so that we can provide an alternative space for people who are living in RVs so that they don't have to park next to businesses with no services for the RVs or next to homes, again, with no services for their RVs.
Yeah, preventing the parking is not the issue. The issue is that somebody needs a place to lay down and rest and be ready for work the next day. That's the issue, and that's what needs to be addressed. Somewhere that somebody, if they need to be in their mobile home, we need to provide a spot where they can find a safe haven to park their RV until we get better transportation where they can find affordable housing, or until we build more housing, of which we need desperately.
Yeah, I think that we all need to step up and deal with the issue. In Mountain View, we've just submitted signatures to overturn the ban on RVs on the street. And there are other cities. Sunnyvale has stepped up with shelter space, but they do have a ban on vehicle parking overnight if the vehicle is over 6 feet tall, which most vans are. And Santa Clara also has a ban. Others do as well. And I think it's just one of those realities that we've squeezed the balloon filled with water, and now it's spilling out in a different direction. And we have got to have the safe parking. We have to have help for people to heat their vans in a safe manner. And as Annie alluded to, have some mercy on people who just need to get ready for work in the morning. And, if you really go out and talk to the people in the vans, you'll find some very good community members there.
Yeah, I often say to my residents, the people who are in RVs are working families, and they're, like I say, they're showering in the gym, they're showering at the office, because they're working, because if they weren't working, they'd drive somewhere cheaper to live, right? So we absolutely need to bear hug those folks and make sure we give them an option. I will tell you that I got confronted as things happen. They bubble up to council, and our public works guys came in and took 2 blocks in our industrial area offline to overnight parking. And it had been through all the process and all the hearings and all the commissioners, and it was only 2 blocks. And it was an impacted area with a lot of auto repair. But I told them, I pulled them aside, because I don't like to embarrass them in public. And I said, look, I'll vote for this tonight, 2 blocks out of our whole industrial area. Don't do this to me again. Because until we have an answer for housing, until we have an answer for the RVs, we have to let people survive, I mean, it's like I sometimes say, that old analogy to the canary in the coal mine, right? The canary dies, you have a coal gas problem. How many dead canaries do we need to see? I mean, my goodness, kids sleeping in cars, RVs, I mean, my goodness.
Yeah, I don't believe we should ban the RVs. And what we've seen is one city banned it, and another city banned it, and then that's really what caused the problem in Mountain View. Then all the RVs went to Mountain View, went to one city that then was grappling with what to do, in Redwood City as well. And so I agree with what people said. I mean, we have to treat this issue and treat these families with compassion. They're trying to get by.
I think this question is written by someone very passionate. Is single-family zoning morally acceptable during a housing crisis? Is there something the state can do to change single-family zoning? And how do you feel about that?
I go first on that one?
You go first.
Well, I think there's a lot of good books that have been written recently, and I've read most of them. I have actually my book club after this tonight, and I suggested Color of Law for my book club, and I recommend everyone read that if they haven't read it. Generation Priced Out is another good one. Segregation by Design. I'm a founding trustee of UC Merced, and our first foundation board trustee endowed chair was for the woman who wrote Segregation by Design. So there's been a lot of good literature on this and saying what's happened, how do we get into this mess? And a lot of the ways we got into this mess, and Menlo Park is a good example. We had a great session recently with a lot of community members talking about the history of racist zoning policies in Menlo Park. So I do think that those zoning policies have a lot to contribute to where we are today. And, I certainly think we have to look at it as ways to get out of it. And, but on the other hand, I think we have to look at a lot of practical things we can do really today. And that's why I talked about the massive infusion of affordable housing and the other things I talked about today.
So when we rezoned our city and took 80 commercial acres offline for mixed-use housing, the next day we had 300 units proposed, and a month later we had another 280 units proposed, 15% affordable. We're on the way to having several thousand units in a brand new neighborhood. So I want to fix this problem at scale. First of all, in a way, there is no more single-family home zoning because everything is at least a duplex, at least by right? Because you can do an ADU. And I think we can struggle and fight and have lots of fights among our communities about whether we should let effectively a duplex, a single-family home become a triplex or a fourplex and barely move the needle on volume of housing. Like, let's focus on what we want to do. We want to get units built. And units built at scale are going to be in apartment buildings. So that's what I want to focus on. Look, a lot of people, maybe even people in this room, like having a backyard. I don't think single-family homes, I get the racist background, absolutely, redlining horrible, absolutely horrible, but people still like having a garden. So I just think it distracts us from where we need to focus, which is on greater density, multifamily housing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree that it's fortuitous for us to focus on what we can do because we are in the middle of a crisis. And I think the ADUs are a great example of that. They fit very well in a single-family neighborhood. If we don't layer them up with fees and we have financing and we have ready-to-go plans that are accepted by the cities, then I think that that's one of the easiest ways to do it. We also can be supportive of organizations like Project Sentinel that match people who have a single-family home with people who just need to rent a room. And it's a very good way to do things where people are vetted and it's a secure system and it works quite well. And I just think that we can't, be sitting at a piano of 88 keys and play 5 of them in the middle of a crisis. We have to look at all of the possibilities that are out there and also improve things for the things like people on the bus at night. There are policies that can improve the way that they're dealt with.
So I love the question. I love the passion. And I would like to say that I hope that the people that are in the single-family homes know that there are solutions so they can help with the problem. ADUs have been mentioned, absolutely one. HIP Housing, an organization that will allow for people to come and share rooms for those that need rooms and are in a 6-bedroom house that are 2 people, 4 bedrooms empty. There's solutions to this problem. So whoever brought this question up, it's something that should be brought up. There's so many good people that are out there willing to share. I want to bring up a little different population of people that are living in these single-family homes that really can't afford to live in these large single-family homes. So we might look at something on the other side of how can we make it easier for a lot of the seniors that are very equity rich that can't afford to make the move because of taxes that are going on. There's a lot of elderly folks that are living in very wealthy neighborhoods that can't pay for the heater in that large home. So whoever brought the question up, thank you. My brain will be spinning tonight for some solutions and some ideas to talk about.
So if we're going to talk about practical solutions to addressing the housing crisis, we have to recognize that just an infusion of cash is not going to fix it. I do think we need an infusion of cash, but part of what keeps us from building more homes is zoning and local zoning and whether or not cities are going to change their zoning and make it possible to build the multifamily homes that you've talked about. ADUs. I mean, the ADUs everybody's lauds the ADUs now, but they came into place because the state put in streamlined ADU processing and didn't allow cities to deny them. So as soon as that happened, then everybody was like, cool, I can build an ADU in my backyard. So I think, the question is the right question to be asking. should we be looking at the opportunity for people, and which SB 50 does, right? Should we be looking at the opportunity to build duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes in single-family neighborhoods? And it can be done. Go walk around downtown Palo Alto, and you'll see some really beautiful, small multifamily homes that look like a large home, but they're actually apartments.
There's an issue about dispersion and having diverse communities. How can you, as a senator, encourage cities to build diverse types of housing throughout their community instead of just in pockets or in other cities?
That's a little cynical.
I mean, I think all of the things we've talked about tonight really get to that question, right? What's your zoning like? Where are you going to allow multifamily housing? Are you going to require affordable housing within multifamily housing? Which again, I'm just going to go back to SB 50 because one of the original criticisms was it didn't require affordable housing. Well, now it does. So it isn't just going to be luxury apartments. It is going to be a mix of affordable and market rate. So how we both allow as cities multifamily housing that has affordable. So Redwood City, we have a 20% inclusionary ordinance. So all new multifamily homes have to have 20% affordable homes in them. And so that is the first sort of step to doing it. But, we started off with talking about racist housing policy. So we're working our way back out of that hole. So it is going to take some time, and it is going to take some political fortitude by all of us.
So could you repeat the question for me, please?
How can you as a senator encourage cities to build a diverse collection of housing throughout your city? So diversity throughout a city.
Diversity in all kinds of ways. And I'm going to go back to Milbray's project and how we have managed to attract affordable housing. We've managed to attract the veterans housing. We've managed to attract retail and commercial projects where people that are going to be taking the train that may not live in the neighborhood be able to come in and work in our diversity of work, diversity of housing, where we're going to have apartments, where they're going to have 2-bedroom apartments, 3-bedroom apartments, small families, single people. I think that the project that we passed and we broke ground to, I think is going to be the perfect project for just what the diversity would be. That's diversity. That's exactly how I'd like to see every city have. Again, at the local jurisdiction's authority.
Okay. Well, one of the things that occurred to me when you mentioned the cities that like to outsource their housing needs was sometimes that makes sense. And under the current state law with the RENA allocations, you can do trades with other cities where you take some of our affordable housing, yes, no, some funding into the mix, because it does make very good sense to have housing, especially dense housing, especially affordable housing near transit. We have a little bit of a continuity problem because our mass transit on the peninsula is not affordable and it at many times is not usable because of the lack of frequency. But placing denser housing near transit makes really good sense. And we have some examples where that hasn't quite worked out. Mountain View, the council that was just previous to me, made the decision to place very large 3-floor single-family homes directly opposite Caltrain. So I think we have to get the mix right and get the continuity right to be able to have it work.
So I think for me, this has been a principle that I've been fighting for 10 years. I sometimes say, and I've said this on the dais in city council, I don't want our community, I don't want our peninsula to become a de facto gated community, which is where I feel like we're on the road to becoming. So in diversity, we're talking about principally economic diversity because all the others are banned, thank God. So economic diversity. And that means here's a trade-off that we have to make. If you want all affordable units, it really has to be on free land. So that's public land. And that then is all affordable in one place, pretty much. Absolutely, we need to have inclusionary housing, so market rate developments have a component of affordable housing within them, and that helps keep things mixed. I'll share with you that when we first started building this neighborhood, I thought it all should be rental because I thought that would let more people in, but I've actually come to a view that a big chunk of small condos and then a really robust first-time home buyer program so that teachers and service providers who make a good salary and can pay the mortgage but can't get up with that down payment, we could get them in and building equity and get off the rent hamster mill. And that does a lot of good things. So I'd like to see a much more robust first-time home buyer program too.
Well, one, I think we need to make the point to all of our neighbors that when we talk about housing for teachers and nurses and tradespeople, it's not just for them, it's for all of us, right? We need them in our community. We need them for good schools. We need them for health care. And we need to get that message out. I'd cite 4 things. One, inclusionary zoning. Still many cities in San Mateo County do not have inclusionary zoning. Second, when I talk about money, part of the reason I do so is we pay billions of income taxes to the state here, and there's a study done, only about 6% of that income tax actually comes back to this region. So Sacramento's been very happy to take our money and say, hey, you deal with the housing and transportation. Third, I wrote an op-ed in the Daily Journal with Joe Ross and saying there's $45 million a year in what's considered excess property tax for our schools. An individual school district can keep it. At the county level, the state is taking that to pay for the court system of all things. They're taking that money, could be used for teacher housing, for example, to pay for the court system. And lastly, this is why I call for the tech community to step up. We're having a lot of these issues because of the growth of the tech community, and we need that community to step up, and that's why I've said if you have more than 1,000 employees, for every job you create, you should fund a unit of housing.
Well, thank you all for your thoughtful answers. I think we'll wrap it up with one last question. What would you like the Bay Area to look like, Bay Area housing to look like for the teachers and policemen and journalists of the next generation? What does the future of the Bay Area look like? Josh?
Well, I just echo what I said. I think we need that diversity, and not just for the teachers and nurses and journalists of the Bay Area, but again, we need it for all of us. And I think that's the message that we need to tell, and that's what I hope as State Senate to be able to go out and tell that story and say, this is for all of us that we need that housing. It's for the good schools for your kids. It's for good health care, but it's also the community that we should want to live in. A diverse community and diverse at all income levels, as well as racial diversity, makes a better community for all of us.
Sorry. So I grew up not far from here. I'm a Peninsula kid, born and raised. And I think we can grow, and we have to grow, and still maintain the amazing quality of life that brought us all here and that we love. So I'm passionate about changing some of the ways the built environment looks. And look, when I was a kid, this was, we were the suburbs, and our people got up in the morning and they drove either to San Francisco or they drove to Silicon Valley for work. And suburbs accept 1 train an hour, a couple of buses. But now we're a string of small cities, and we need to start acting like that. So cities insist on good transit. Here's how you know when you have a world-class transit system, when you don't look at the train schedule anymore to see if a train is coming, right? You just show up because one is going to be there in 10 or 12 minutes. That's what we need, and we need so much more all around the Bay. Then what I see, to answer your question, Lou, is a string of 5- and 6-story buildings that are along the spines, probably, but in some cities like Mountain View, they'll be over by the jobs on the Bay, and it feels a lot more like older cities that are not Manhattan, not San Francisco. I got to keep telling that to some of my residents, but that have density and feel good and have transit and are beautiful and still a great climate and parks and all the rest of it. And we can do that. I know we can.
Yeah, I'd like to see every single one of my constituents having a safe, clean, quiet place to develop their lives, to have that access to the open space, to have seamless access to transit, and just to be able to live their lives. You know, the current situation with housing is traumatizing so many people. And when we talk about, you know, the history of redlining and all these things, how about the savage level of chasing people of color and the undocumented out of the Bay Area that's going on right now? And when people get chased out of housing around here because of the vicious level of gentrification, they cannot find anything else within 3 hours of the Bay Area. They are out, and really out for a lifetime. So I would like to see us be able to go back to the diversity of economic classes that we had before, of various economic levels, being able to live together, being able to volunteer for schools, and work together as a community.
How I'd like to see it is just the way I had it growing up. I was born and raised here, and I know that this district made room for people like my mom and dad and my husband, Jose, immigrants, children of immigrants. They, with hard work and courage, they made dreams come true. And that's what we're about. And that's what, this is not a new issue. Housing is not a new issue. It's something that we just haven't addressed. So how I see it going forward is exactly the way I was raised. And I'm very privy and I'm very blessed. And I would love to share that blessing and that privilege going forward. And I know I can do that if I get to Sacramento.
So my family moved, my husband and my daughter and I moved to California in 1999. We moved to Mountain View. We lived in Mountain View for almost 5 years, and then we moved to Redwood City. And the reason we chose those two communities was because there was economic and racial diversity, both in the schools and in the people who lived there. So my vision is communities maintain that diversity, which we are currently losing, as we've all talked about, right? And as the mom of a teacher who's living with me, because she can't afford, so teachers are not making enough money, by the way, to pay their rent, much less to ever save it to buy a house. My pledge is to work towards making it possible. But we have to tackle it from a variety of different ways. We have to tackle it from a wages issue. We have to tackle it from funding issues. We have to tackle it from building issues. There's a set of priorities and policies and systems changes that we need to make to have a diverse community here in the Bay Area.
Well, thank you so much for all your insights and your patience. Let's give the candidates a round of applause. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thanks again to our host, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and the sponsors of this, the Silicon Valley at Home Action Fund and Tech Equity. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.